Arrival at the monastery. They didn't warn me about the smell. No, seriously. The letters made it sound poetic. A sacred place nestled in the hills, where stone arches met the sky and chants echoed like whispers from heaven. What they left out was the stench. And let me tell you, nothing, not the prayers, not the candles, not even divine grace, can mask the odor of 24 monks who haven't bathed since the Crusades. I arrived just after dawn, feet blistered from the journey, my travel cloak stiff with dust and last night's rain. The monastery loomed above like a great stone beast, its towers shrouded in morning mist, its breath warm and vaguely cabbage-scented. A brother greeted me at the gate, silent, hooded, and slightly crusty. When he waved me in, the movement released a faint puff of what I can only describe as spiritual mildew. Inside, the air was thick. Not just with incense though, there was that too, but with something else. Sweat, damp wool, waxed the musk of unwashed humanity. My nose protested, my eyes watered. But I didn't come here to judge. I came here to seek. Seek what? At the time, I wasn't sure. Enlightenment, escape, maybe just a quiet place where I wouldn't be expected to explain my career choices to disappointed uncles. But as soon as I stepped into the monks' dormitory, all I could think about was air, fresh air, the kind that didn't carry the aroma of sanctified foot fungus. The dormitory was a long, low room lined with wooden planks and straw mattresses. No pillows, no blankets, unless you counted the communal woolen thing that looked like it had survived a siege. My bed was a plank near the middle. Someone else's robe hung above it, possibly as a warning. I dropped my pack and sat, resisting the urge to scratch. A monk passed behind me, murmuring Latin and reeking of something between fermented onions and quiet shame. I smiled politely. He did not. Later, I learned about their philosophy on cleanliness. Dirt, to them, was holy. Washing was vanity. One of the older monks, Brother Elias, a kind man with a squint and impressive beard lice, told me proudly that he hadn't changed his robe in 25 years. The lice are part of God's design, he said. They humble us. I wasn't sure if I was being spiritually tested or just slowly pickled. Meals didn't help. The kitchen smelled like boiled regret. Our first supper was barley gruel, a hunk of crusty bread, and something that looked like cabbage but may have once been sock lining. No meat? Not unless it was a feast day. When I asked what we were celebrating, Brother Hugo blinked slowly and said, "Penitence, sleep was worse. Have you ever tried to drift off to the sound of a dozen monks snoring, one of them muttering about sins in his dreams, another possibly dying, and one definitely farting with rhythmic precision? Still, something about the place got to me. The rhythm of prayer, the stillness of the cloister, the way the sunrise hit the old stone walls and made them glow like fire. It was filthy, sure, and stinky, but also strangely peaceful, like time moved differently here. Slower, more deliberate. One morning, after an especially pungent matins, I found myself scrubbing the altar steps with rose oil and coarse cloth. My fingers burned from the lye, my knees ached, but the scent finally, a pleasant scent. It filled my lungs and I almost wept, not just from the fumes, maybe. I thought this was part of the lesson. Not all things clean were visible, not all filth was filth, and maybe, just maybe, if I stayed long enough, I'd come to smell like sanctity too. God help me. Mud, mystery, and morning breath. By the time I stepped outside, the air hit me like a warm, wet sock. It had rained last night again, which meant every street was now a sludge trap. A medieval smoothie of mud, manure, and whatever the neighbor's goat left behind. I pulled my cloak tighter. Not that it helped. The fabric had long since given up pretending to be waterproof. It was basically a portable sponge that smelled like damp wool and regret. My boots squelched with every step. Not a satisfying crunch like walking on fresh snow, no. This was the kind of squish that makes you pause and silently pray. Please let that just be mud. Spoiler. It usually wasn't. A pig darted past me, trailing what looked like someone's discarded tunic. Behind it, a toddler screamed with laughter, chasing it barefoot. I nearly collided with a cart overflowing with fish heads. The driver looked at me like I was the one out of place. like he wasn't the one casually leaking fish oil onto the cobblestones. I ducked down an alley to avoid the crowd and immediately regretted it. The smell hit me like a theological crisis. You know the phrase, wall of stink? This one had depth, layers like a wine-tasting menu of human despair. First note, rotten cabbage, mid-palate, wet dog, finishing aroma. Oh, definitely a dead rat in a shoe, a warm shoe. This, of course, is where someone opened a window above me and shouted "Gardy-loo." I didn't speak much French, but I knew exactly what that meant. I leapt sideways just as a splash landed inches from where I'd been standing. Chamber pot contents, vintage, pungent, and still steaming. You haven't lived until you've narrowly dodged someone else's fermented breakfast landing on your boots. Somehow, this was normal. I kept walking, dodging puddles of questionable origin, trying to breathe through my mouth, which, in hindsight, was not an improvement. The air may have smelled worse through my nose, but at least my tongue didn't taste it. When I finally reached the main market square, the fog was just starting to lift, revealing rows of stalls selling everything from wilted herbs to animal organs with names I didn't dare ask about. Somewhere nearby, a street musician was playing a slightly off-key lute, accompanied by a chicken pecking at his tip jar. I passed a baker, who tossed a scorched loaf into the gutter like it owed him money. A butcher wiped blood off his hands and offered me a suspiciously red sausage. I declined. I'd learned from yesterday. That sausage had moved. You might think I'm exaggerating. I wish I were. But this city, whether it's Paris or Cologne, Bruges or Florence, all shared the same aromatic signature. Medieval funk, it didn't discriminate. Rich, poor, child, monk, noble, we all stewed in it. And yet, you adjusted. Your nose just gave up, like an overworked scribe who'd seen too many lost causes. After a while, you stop noticing. That's the terrifying part. The stink became normal. As I made my way back toward the boarding house, a passing noble trotted by on horseback. His robe shimmered with embroidered gold. His perfume slapped me in the face like a perfume glove. Jasmine, clove, and something faintly resembling licorice. It was an improvement until he rode past, and the backdraft revealed his true cologne. Months of sweat sealed under velvet. No amount of rosewater can hide 3 weeks of fermented duke. I ducked into the shadows, clutching my satchel closer, suddenly aware that I hadn't washed in days either. But at least I tried not to smell like wealth rotting from the inside out. Back at the boarding house, I scraped off my boots with a stick, which I then immediately threw into the fire, washed my hands with a vinegar rag, and sat down to dinner, turnip stew and a crust of bread that could chip a tooth. And when I finally crawled into bed, a straw mattress that smelled like wet hay and someone else's dreams, I whispered to myself, the same prayer every traveler in this time learns to say, "Dear God, please let me wake up tomorrow, slightly less pungent than today." Straw beds and shared secrets. If you've never shared a sleeping space with 12 other people, 2 goats, and a chicken named Martin Luther, let me tell you, you're missing out on an experience that really tests the soul and the sinuses. The boarding house I stayed at was what you'd call budget conscious. It was run by a widow named Bruna, who was equal parts kind and terrifying kind when she offered you an extra ladle of stew, terrifying when you dared ask what meat was in it. "It's stew meat," she'd say, eyes narrowing. "You asked too many questions." The sleeping quarters were up a rickety ladder that felt like it was built during a time when safety hadn't been invented yet. At the top was a long wooden hall filled with rows of tightly packed straw mattresses. No partitions, no curtains, just you, your neighbors, and the slow, creeping realization that someone near you had garlic for dinner. Again, my bed, or more accurately, my assigned rectangle of hay atop uneven planks, was wedged between a blacksmith named Otto, who snored like he was exorcising demons, and a novice monk named Theobald, who, despite vows of silence, somehow managed to mumble in Latin in his sleep. The mattress smelled, lived in, a mix of old sweat, barn animal, and the faint whiff of mouldy apples. I tried fluffing it one night, and a spider crawled out. I named him Charles and gave him a corner. Now, you'd think the worst part was the smell, or the noise, or waking up in the middle of the night because someone else's foot was on your face. And yes, those were all bad. But honestly, the worst part was the itching, lyte, fleas, mystery bites from insects you never see. It was like the mattress came with its own ecosystem. People would wake up scratching like it was a dance ritual. There was a guy named Eve who claimed if you rubbed onion and vinegar on your skin, it kept the bugs away. He always smelled like salad, but he did scratch less than the rest of us. Still, you couldn't be too precious about privacy. Bathing happened maybe once every 2 weeks, and even that was a group event. Once, Bruna boiled a cauldron in the yard, and a line formed like it was Christmas morning. 1 bucket, 1 ladle, same water. By the time it was my turn, the steam had gone, and the water had turned a dubious shade of soup. I washed my arms and immediately regretted everything. To pass time at night, we'd trade stories anything to distract us from the ambient chorus of wheezing and bed creaks. Otto once told a tale about a man who farted so loud during Mass that the priest accused him of being possessed. I laughed so hard I choked on my own spit. Bruna scolded us for blasphemous giggling and threatened to swap our straw for nettles. The strangest thing, though, I started to like it. There was a strange intimacy to it all. When you've heard someone sneeze themselves awake, or confess in their sleep to stealing turnips, or seen a chicken hop onto a woman's head in the middle of the night, you develop a weird kind of trust, a shared understanding that, despite the stench, the bugs, and the chorus of bodily functions, you're in this together. Each night, I'd curl up under my itchy wool blanket, listen to the snores and mutters around me, and let the distant sound of the cathedral bell lull me towards sleep. And if I couldn't fall asleep, well, I'd count lice, the privy problem. Where the real trials begin, there's a moment in every time traveler's life, and trust me, this happens every single time when you realize you've forgotten to ask the most important question before jumping centuries backward. That question is, where's the bathroom? In medieval Europe, the answer was complicated. See, back home in the 21st century, I used to complain if a public restroom didn't have paper towels. Now, I would sell my left shoe for a door that closes, or even a toilet seat that didn't feel like it had survived the Black Plague personally. Let me paint the picture. The monastery, where I occasionally helped sweep floors and tried very hard not to breathe too deeply, had what they lovingly called a reredoter. Sounds fancy, right? It's not. It's a glorified outhouse, a long wooden bench with multiple keyhole-shaped openings, suspended over a pit that God seems to have forgotten. I'll say this, the monks had a real flair for understatement. They'd pray before entering and after leaving, and I now know why. Walking in there was like confronting all 7 deadly sins at once, especially sloth. There were no partitions, no privacy. You'd just perch next to someone who might be singing hymns under their breath, while you clutched your robe and tried to remember why you thought time travel was a good idea. One monk, Brother Lambert, once told me the privy was a place to contemplate humility. I think he meant spiritually, but I felt it physically. The seat was a roughly carved plank with enough splinters to qualify as a torture device. I tried folding my cloak for padding, but it slid right into the hole. A tragic loss I mourn to this day. And let's talk odour. Imagine 1,000 years of cabbage stew, a la breath, and spiritual constipation, simmering in an open-air pit. Add flies, lots of flies, and maybe a chicken or two that wandered in by accident. I started timing my visits carefully early morning, before the sun cooked the stench into the walls. But even then, the air carried a permanent, musty tang of ammonia and spiritual regret. The city wasn't much better. In town, you either used a chamber pot or prayed you were fast enough to make it to a public convenience. These were alley-side wooden stalls shared by whoever got there first. And yes, there was often a line. No, nobody stood politely. Some folks didn't bother with stalls. They'd toss the contents of their chamber pots right into the street with a shouted "Gardy-loo," which, loosely translated, means look out below. Something deeply unpleasant is headed your way. I learned that the hard way. One afternoon, I was strolling down a narrow lane, enjoying what I thought was fresh air, when a woman leaned out from the second floor and yelled something in French. Before I could ask for a translation, splash. right on my boots. That's the day I started walking closer to the middle of the street and developed a sudden obsession with waterproof footwear. Fun fact, they didn't exist. Now, there was one surprising innovation I came across. Some castles had multi-story latrines, literally little turrets that jutted out from the walls, with openings that emptied straight into the moat. This sounded promising, until I realized the moat was less decorative water feature and more fermented cesspool. Still, I'll give them points for engineering. Gravity, the original plumbing system. Did I ever get used to it? No, not remotely. But after a few weeks, I stopped gagging as much. I developed a technique. Deep breath before entry, mouth closed the entire time, and focus on a happy place, usually a memory of a scented candle aisle at Target. That said, I started to understand something about medieval folks. When your daily routine includes this, you become incredibly strong in body, no sir, and spirit. You don't sweat the small stuff anymore. You sweat the large stuff, like whether that buzzing noise is a fly or something far more tragic. The monastic kitchen, a symphony of cabbage and consequences. If you've ever wondered what regret smells like, let me direct you to the kitchen of a 13th century monastery. Let me be clear, I didn't expect gourmet meals. I wasn't holding out for truffle risotto or a medium rare steak with rosemary glaze. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepares you for the sheer emotional impact of a pot of overcooked turnips bubbling on a fire that's older than some countries. The first time I stepped into the monastery's kitchen, it was a sensory ambush. The heat smacked me in the face like a warm wool blanket soaked in sweat and broth. Smoke drifted lazily from a blackened hearth, curling around the rafters like it was looking for a way out, just like me. And the smell, it was layered. Imagine the earthy punch of boiled cabbage, not just today's cabbage, but an ancestral cabbage, one that had been simmering continuously for weeks in a heavy iron cauldron. Add to that the pungency of old garlic, a hint of turnip anxiety, and a deep, underlying funk of wet wool and scorched wood. That's medieval umami, right there. Meals were simple. Not simple like trendy minimalist plating, more like, here is your bowl of beige mush. Good luck. They called it pottage, a stew-like mix of grains, legumes, root vegetables, and whatever happened to be nearby and not already moldy. Every bowl was a surprise. Sometimes it had peas. Sometimes it had old bread. One time I swear I found a feather. If you were lucky, there'd be meat. But don't get too excited. Meat was only allowed on special feast days. And even then, it was often, let's say, well-aged. The monks didn't waste anything, including goats that had passed away of natural causes or questionable cheese. And oh, the cheese. It was hard, sour, and seemed mildly sentient. You didn't slice it, you negotiated with it. I once watched a monk tap a wheel of cheese with a wooden spoon, nod solemnly, and then walk away. That cheese is probably still waiting for someone brave enough to try again. Now, monks believed in moderation, so meals were portioned accordingly. A ladle of pottage, a slab of coarse bread that doubled as a dental hazard, maybe an onion if the garden had been generous, and a mug of small ale, because the water was often unsafe. That ale, it was weak, cloudy, and tasted like someone had stored it in a boot, but it was safer than the alternative, a stream that doubled as a bath. Laundry zone and livestock spa, meals were silent affairs, total quiet. You ate while contemplating God. Sin, and how cabbage could smell that aggressive without being weaponized. If someone accidentally burped, they'd cross themselves in horror. Meanwhile, I was just trying not to choke on a leek string. One day, I made the mistake of wandering into the kitchen before dawn, hoping to snag a bit of bread early. Brother Cadwin, the cook, was already stirring the cauldron, shirtless and sweating like a medieval sauna ghost. He looked at me, narrowed his eyes, and said, "The pottage knows when it's being watched." I haven't looked a stew in the eye since. The kitchen wasn't just a food zone, it was also the warmest place in the monastery. So monks gathered there to thaw out their fingers, dry their sandals, and occasionally have spiritual debates about whether lentils counted as sinful indulgence. Verdict, only if salted. Despite the smell, despite the mystery ingredients, despite the ever-present threat of intestinal rebellion, the kitchen had a strange charm. It was where you heard the occasional chuckle, the clatter of wooden spoons, and the rare, blessed sound of someone humming under their breath. And hey, after a few weeks, your nose gives up, like it just taps out. You stop noticing the layers of funk and start recognizing people by their individual stew scent. Brother Jerome, parsnips and regret. Sister Agnes always carried a whisper of leeks and something that might have once been pork. So yes, I ate the cabbage, I drank the boot boy, I learned to chew with determination and faith. And somehow, in that smoky, onion-scented cauldron room, I started to feel like I belonged. But then came the bathhouse. And that, dear reader, is where things get steamy. The bathhouse, steam, sins, and soapy secrets. I'll be honest. After weeks of sharing sleeping quarters with monks who believed lice were a spiritual companion, I would have bathed in vinegar and goat tears if that meant scrubbing the crust off my soul. So when I first heard whispers of a stew in town, not the edible kind, mind you, but the Middle English word for bathhouse, I didn't walk, I ran. Now, I didn't know what to expect. In my modern brain, I pictured something between a sauna and a day spa. What I got was, well, surreal. The moment I stepped through the heavy wooden door, I was hit by a wall of humid, herbal breath, thick with rosemary and something vaguely sweet and suspicious. Steam clung to the air like a ghost that couldn't let go. Shapes moved through the fog half naked, full laughing. Occasionally moaning I chose not to investigate, and completely unbothered by my utter shock. There were no dividers, no curtains, no shame, just tubs. Big wooden ones, small copper ones, stone pools built into the floor. Men and women together, yes. Together lounging, drinking, scrubbing, chatting, and occasionally giggling far too flirtatiously for a place that was supposedly about cleanliness. I stood there like an idiot, fully clothed, clutching a borrowed towel and trying not to make eye contact with a guy massaging someone's shoulders, while singing in what I can only describe as medieval falsetto. An attendant, a sharp-eyed woman named Mava, who wore nothing but a linen wrap and a smirk, handed me a rough cloth, a bar of waxy soap, and said, "Try not to drown, and if you do, don't blame us." The priest already did. The priest? Of course. Apparently, the local clergy had been trying to shut the place down for years, claiming it was a den of lust and disease. And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. This wasn't just a place for washing your body. It was where courtship happened, business deals were made, and on occasion, spiritual massages were exchanged for coins under the steam. It was a spa crossed with a bar crossed with a dating app, all in real time, with no clothes and plenty of ale. Still, I couldn't resist. I stripped, dipped a toe into the warm water, and then slowly lowered myself into a tub that smelled faintly of lavender and deeply of other people's decisions. The heat hit my joints like a choir of angels. My skin started to soften. I could feel the grime of the monastery melting away. A man beside me offered me a cup of wine red. Sweet, probably brewed in a boot like everything else. I accepted, and for the first time since arriving in this century, I breathed deeply and didn't immediately gag. I stayed for what felt like hours. Scrubbed, soaked, even got a scalp massage from a cheerful woman who told me she used to be a baker, but switched to bathhouse work because it paid better and men tip more when their eyes are closed. Before leaving, I caught sight of a sign hanging above the inner door, written in Old English. It read, "Rules of the stew. No fighting, no gambling, no loud singing, no excessive splashing." That last one stuck with me. What exactly was excessive splashing? Did someone measure it? Was there a splash referee? I had questions and more wine. But here's the twist. The dream didn't last. Just a few days later, I came back to find the bathhouse shuttered. A red wax seal on the door. A grim-faced city official told me it had been closed for reasons of moral contagion and spiritual corrosion. Translation: the church won again. So I walked away, still damp, towel slung over my shoulder, the scent of rosemary and heartbreak fading into the wind. And that, dear reader, was the last proper bath I had for the next 3 weeks. If I ever smell lavender and old ale again in the same breath, I might cry. But even as the bathhouses were disappearing, a new smell was rising. one made not of soap and herbs, but wealth and arrogance. The nobles, their perfumed gloves, scented commanders, and rosewater-soaked delusions. And you bet I was about to crash that party next. A perfumed illusion when stink met status. I hadn't been clean for a week when I got the invitation. Well, not really an invitation, more like a bribe. A nudge and a forged letter of introduction. Details. The important part was, I had a chance to sneak into a medieval noble's banquet. And after surviving monastery funk and the final gasp of the bathhouse scene, I wanted to see how the other half stank. Spoiler, it was worse. You'd think the wealthy would smell better. They had money, servants, imported goods, entire wardrobes made from silk and gilt, but no bathing was still suspect, even among the elite. Instead, they'd mastered the ancient art of overcompensation by fragrance. When I walked into that hall, enormous, echoing with laughter and lute music, it hit me like a brick of rotting lilies and burnt cinnamon. A noblewoman glided past, her velvet gown trailing behind her like a cloud of powdered roses and something else. Musk, amber, goat breath wearing a corset. She had a pomander, a silver globe dangling from her belt, pierced with tiny holes, releasing puffs of scent with every step. A walking diffuser. Basically, I saw 3 more on other nobles. One guy had his sewn into his sleeve and kept sniffing it like it was medieval vapor-rubby. These weren't just accessories. They were survival gear. You see, nobles weren't bathing, but they were fermenting. Some had perfumed gloves, leather soaked in oils of orange blossom or cloves. Others had sachets of dried herbs stitched into their collars. A few even carried tiny sponges dipped in rose vinegar, pressing them discreetly against their noses when the air got too peasanty. I wandered to the feast table. Roast swan, boiled pears, a hunk of venison that looked like it had challenged someone to a duel and lost. Everything was richly seasoned, partly for taste, partly to cover up the fact that it might be a little too well aged, if you know what I mean. Then I smelled him, the Duke of something fancy, sitting at the center of it all, laughing like a man who'd never washed his own hands. He reeked of garlic, wine, and a kind of sharp floral note that reminded me of Grandma's bathroom in the worst possible way. Think, old lace curtain meets dead marzipan. He spotted me, called me over. You there? You smell different. I wasn't sure if that was an insult or a compliment. I think it's fear, I said. He roared with laughter and slapped my back so hard I nearly landed in a bowl of stewed figs. The evening wore on. Every minute, I learned a new rule of scent survival. Never sit downwind of someone in armor. The smell gets trapped under the plates like soup in Tupperware. Avoid the musicians. They sweat more than anyone and perfume less. If you're offered a pomander sniff, take it. It's considered polite. It's also your only shot at fresh air. Eventually, I found a moment alone near the tapestry-lined walls. I took out the herbal sachet Maeva had given me before the bathhouse shut down rosemary, mint, and dried orange peel. I pressed it to my nose, breathed in, and tried to remember a time when clean meant something other than less horrible. And yet, for all their stink, for all the absurdity of masking death with daisies, these nobles tried. They believed scent was status, that if they smelled exotic and expensive, they could hold off the rot, physical or moral, just a little longer. Some even believed good smells could ward off disease, that if you carried ambergris literal whale vomit in a locket, you might dodge the plague. Was it science? No. Did it work? Absolutely not. Did it make them feel powerful? Holy. Untouchable. You bet your stinking doublet it did. And who was I to argue as I left the hall that night full of wine, viol, and existential despair? I passed a servant lighting bundles of dried lavender and tossing them into iron wall braziers. The smoke curled up, mixing with the sweet rot of the feast. An illusion of purity, a theatrical deodorant. It was beautiful. It was awful. It was so perfectly medieval. The peasant's perfume, cabbage, ale, and honest sweat. After the noble feast, I thought nothing could shock my nose again. I'd sniffed whale vomit and velvet sweat, chewed through venison soaked in clove syrup, and politely complimented a lady whose breath smelled like garlic boiled in wine. I was wrong. A week later, I found myself back in the village, not as glamorous, sure, but surprisingly easier on the senses. You see, Peasants stank differently. Not better. Not worse. Just more authentically. Let me paint the olfactory picture. It starts with earth. Not perfume, not incense. Just honest, muddy earth. Most villagers spent their days tilling soil, walking barefoot through gardens, sleeping with goats literally, not biblically. Mostly, their scent was a cocktail of turnip tops, old wool, damp wood, and freshly sweated human, and somehow, it was easier to handle. I stayed with a family for a few days. Jakob, his wife Ellen, their 3 children, and a goat named Biscuit, who clearly ruled the household. Breakfast was always the same. Stale rye bread softened in ale, with a bit of fermented cabbage if we were lucky. The sauerkraut scent lingered in the air like an uninvited cousin tart. Aggressive, a little gassy. But it was familiar, like home. The kids didn't even flinch. One of them, Toma, could burp the alphabet in Latin, probably not what the monks intended. But impressive nonetheless. Jakob, the father, had the musk of a man who split wood in the morning and wrestled pigs in the afternoon. But he owned it. He didn't try to mask it with lavender. He just grunted, wiped his face with his sleeve, and called it a day. And honestly, that felt refreshing. There was no shame here, no pretense, no embroidered sachets or pomanders. Their idea of scent control was a sprig of mint behind the ear or, if it was a festival day, rubbing a bit of crushed rosemary on the wrists. I asked Ellen once how she dealt with the constant stink. She shrugged. If I can still smell him, it means he hasn't died. Fair enough. But let's talk about the real villain of the village. The outhouse. No running water, no flushing, just a wooden shed, a pit, and a centuries-old contest between flies, mold, and human willpower. I'll spare you the visuals, but I will say this. Holding your breath became a survival skill. And yet, in a strange way, that too was just part of the rhythm. Villagers didn't expect life to smell good. They expected it to function. You worked, you ate, you farted, you survived. Repeat. Speaking of farting, flatulence was a public event. No one excused themselves. No one blushed. At dinner, someone would rip one, and the only reaction was maybe a joke or a toast. I once saw a man let one fly during Sunday Mass, and someone behind him shouted, "Praise be his soul's escaping." To them, digestion was life, loud, gassy, earthy life. Food was rough, oats, beans, old cheese. It churned in your belly like a mill wheel with a broken tooth. And when that gas needed out, it came out. Let me be clear, bodily function wasn't hidden. It was just there, like the weather. Or taxes. You know what wasn't there? Shame. Even though the smells in the village could be gag-worthy, the sour milk, the latrine breeze, the endless feet, they somehow felt less toxic than the stink of court. Because they weren't pretending. They were honest. The villagers didn't wrap their decay in velvet and cinnamon. They didn't believe bad smells made them sinful, or that good ones made them holy. They just lived in their own skin, stinky as it was. And they had some clever tricks. They'd burn dried sage in the fireplace to chase off cooking smells. They'd hang bunches of lavender and yarrow by the door, not just to mask the air but to keep out pests. Even the goat smelled like rosemary once apparently. One of the kids had decided Biscuit needed a blessing. It worked. Kind of. By the 3rd day, I barely noticed the stench. My nose gave up, or maybe it adjusted, or maybe I was becoming one of them. After all, my own tunic had begun to develop a certain pungent personality. I caught a whiff of myself one night and thought, is that me? It was, and you know what? I didn't hate it. Out here, there was freedom in stink, a kind of primal democracy. We all reeked. No one was better. No one sniffed down their nose. Probably because they were afraid of what they'd inhale. It was muddy. It was human. It was honest survival. Still, when I left the village a week later, Ellen handed me a farewell gift, a sprig of thyme tied with goat hair. For your next adventure, she said. I tucked it into my satchel, between my crusty linen shirt and a hunk of cheese so sharp it could probably be used as a weapon. She smiled. Just remember, if someone says they don't smell, they're either dead or lying. Amen. Ellen, the plague doctor, sense, science, and superstition. I smelled him before I saw him. A strange aroma drifted down the road: clove, vinegar, and something sharp, like crushed marigolds baked under the sun. Then he came around the bend, waddling slowly beneath layers of black robes, gloves, boots, and that infamous mask. You know, the one, long beak, glass eyes, nightmare fuel. A plague doctor. He looked like a bird had joined a secret cult and graduated from medical school with 0 lab experience and a diploma written in Latin and goat blood. "Good morning," I offered, trying not to look startled or amused. He stopped, sniffed, or at least I think he did, through that beak and nodded slowly. His voice, when it came, was muffled but grave. "Keep your distance. The miasmas are thick today." Ah, yes, the medieval boogeyman. Miasma, invisible, poisonous air. To them, bad smells didn't just offend, they killed. Breathing in the wrong whiff could invite fever, boils, madness, and the dreaded Black Death. And so, the beak wasn't just for show. It was stuffed with protective herbs, rose petals, lavender, myrrh, camphor, mint, anything with a scent strong enough to block out the bad airs. He pulled out a pouch, marjoram and wormwood, best blend I've made all season. He tapped the beak twice, proudly. I didn't have the heart to tell him he smelled like salad dressing left in the sun. Still, I was fascinated. I asked him how he treated the plague. Bloodletting, of course. And if that fails, onions, sliced and tied to the feet, draws the poison out. "Oh," I said carefully, "and that works." He tilted his head. "Sometimes, unless the devil gets there first." I wasn't sure if he meant metaphorically or literally. With plague medicine, it was hard to tell. He went on to describe the scent barriers he set up in houses. Bowls of vinegar on windowsills, herbs stuffed in chimneys. Occasionally, he'd burn bundles of juniper and fan the smoke through doorways like a priest with holy water. It was part ritual, part deodorizer, and entirely based on the belief that smell was the battlefield between life and death. And honestly, it sort of made sense. In a world without microscopes or penicillin, people used the tools they had: noses, guts, and blind hope. He invited me to walk with him for a while. As we strolled, he told me about his travels. I once saw a man burst a boil with a hot iron rod, thought he was cured, died the next morning. "Oh," I said again, because what else do you say? And a woman who washed in wine daily to ward off sickness. She survived the plague, but went bankrupt and started licking door handles. He paused, I suspect unrelated. There was a strange poetry to it, this grim, fragrant world of home remedies and desperate measures. People burning rosemary for their souls, drinking vinegar like holy water, rubbing mustard on their temples to heat the brain. I even met one man who wore a bag of fermented toad guts around his neck. For protection. From what? Dignity. No one really knew what worked, so they did everything. Sometimes all at once. You'd walk into a house and be hit with so many smells: burnt onions, boiling herbs, sweaty bodies, dead rats, that you couldn't tell if someone was sick or seasoning soup. The plague doctor didn't question it. He just moved from town to town like some kind of olfactory exorcist, lighting fires, doling out herbs, bleeding people, and whispering prayers through a waxed linen beak. He wasn't a fraud. He truly believed he was helping. And in his own bizarre way, he was. Sometimes hope smells like marjoram and desperation. That evening, we camped under a chestnut tree. He brewed tea from his herb pouch and offered me a sip. It tasted like hot regret, with notes of licorice and sadness. Builds immunity, he said proudly. I didn't question it. Before bed, he pulled out a scroll of note sketches of boils, symptoms, herbal combinations, and bizarre marginalia like "do not bleed the cow again" and cloves, 6 fewer ghosts. He looked at me through the glass eyes of the mask. You smell clean. I blinked. Thanks. You've been near villagers. Honest stink. Not infected. Not yet. Comforting. He fell asleep quickly, wrapped like a sentient bundle of waxed wool and stale herbs. I lay awake, the scent of vinegar and crushed thyme swirling in the air, wondering how many lives he'd saved, or lost, or just mildly fumigated. The next morning, I woke to birdsong and an empty spot where the plague doctor had been. just a faint trail of cloves in the breeze. He'd vanished as quietly as he arrived. I never saw him again, but sometimes, when I catch the scent of burning sage or rotting marjoram, I think of him, a walking contradiction, a man who fought death with a bird mask, bad science, and a nose full of flowers. And somehow, that's one of the more rational things I saw that year. Market day, the medieval nose gauntlets. If hell had a farmer's market, it would smell like this. I arrived at the city gates just after sunrise. My coin purse light, but my curiosity heavier than a sack of mouldy turnips. Market day. The square was already buzzing, vendors shouting, children darting between carts, pigs squealing, bells ringing, chickens escaping their cages like feathery jailbreakers. And the smell? Oh, the smell. It hit me like a punch from a sweaty knight in full armor, a nose-melting medley of garlic, fish, manure, old cheese, wet wool, and human hope, a scent so thick. It should have had a toll booth. I instinctively reached for my pomander today, loaded with rosemary, dried rose petals, and a desperate pinch of clove. I pressed it to my face like a lifeline, breathing in my private oasis of semi-freshness while the rest of the world marinated in olfactory chaos. The streets were paved with cobblestones and garbage. Literally, fruit rinds, fish heads, animal bones, medieval compost tossed straight from windows. There were public laws against it, sure, but enforcement was as reliable as medieval dentistry. Mind your step, a woman hollered, just as a horse relieved itself in front of me with what I can only describe as biblical enthusiasm. I sidestepped the mess and ducked under a tattered awning where a butcher was hacking away at something that may have once been a cow, or perhaps an unlucky horse. His apron looked like it had fought in a crusade. The air around his stall was metallic, raw, and layered with the scent of drying blood. Across from him, a cheese seller was fanning flies off her wares, rounds of yellow, cracked dairy that smelled like feet on vacation. She grinned at me, holding out a chunk, fresh this week. I nodded politely, trying not to gag. I believe you, with every breath. Further down, a fishmonger was practically swimming in mackerel. Salted, smoked, dried, or just barely dead, each pile emitted its own unique perfume. The most aggressive one smelled like a dare. Only a farthing for the tail. He barked. Only my dignity if I eat it, I muttered. But the worst offenders were the tanners. If you've never smelled a medieval tannery, let me set the scene. Animal hides soaked in urine, dung, lime, and despair. It's the kind of stink that rewires your DNA. The workers stood barefoot in vats, stirring the slurry with long paddles and expressions of spiritual resignation. I passed them holding my breath until my face turned purple. Worth it. And yet, somehow, I loved it. It was raw, real. This wasn't the sterilized scentscape of palaces or monasteries. This was humanity, loud, messy, alive, and stinking of everything that made life work: food, trade, survival, ambition, rot, and renewal. There were street performers too, flute players, jugglers, even a man pretending to be a chicken for coins. No idea why. Maybe performance art, or maybe he just was a chicken. Hard to say. And food carts. Oh, bless them. Roasted meat on sticks, boiled cabbage with spices, flatbread smeared with goat cheese and mystery herbs. Some of it smelled amazing peppery, rich, cooked over open flame, and some of it smelled like someone had tried to bake regret into a pie. One stand sold honey cakes that drew a crowd. I bought one and bit in. It was dense, sweet, gritty, possibly with a hint of gravel. I didn't care. My teeth could protest later. Right now, I was part of the rhythm of the city, chewing, breathing, dodging goats. In a quieter alley, I found an herbalist selling scent sachets and incense cones. We struck up a conversation about fumigation spells and spiritual cleanliness. She let me sniff a pouch of dried lavender and chamomile. "This one's for clarity," she said. I nodded. "Does it work?" She smiled. "Well, you won't smell your neighbor's socks. Good enough for me." I bought 2. As the sun climbed, the smell got heavier, meat spoiling in the heat. Bodies packed together like damp laundry. Rivers of sweat. Even the pomander couldn't save me now. My nostrils surrendered. I embraced the stink. I became the stink. And somewhere in all that funk and frenzy, I realized something. This city breathed. It wasn't clean. It wasn't organized. It certainly wasn't subtle, but it was alive in a way that no monastery ever was. It was a marketplace of souls, shouting and stinking and trying to sell you a slightly bruised pear. And somehow, I wouldn't have had it any other way. Perfume, power, and putrefaction. A visit to the noble household. You'd think money could buy you out of the stench. I did. Anyway, after spending a day breathing in the baked fish and barnyard funk of the market, I thought a visit to my distant cousin, Lady Isolde of Brackenridge Hall, would offer a breath of fresh air. After all, her estate boasted gardens, fountains, and silk curtains imported from Venice. Surely that meant clean air. Right, I was wrong. So gloriously, florally, musky wrong. The moment I stepped into the great hall, I was hit by what I can only describe as a luxury miasma, a swirl of rose oil, damp velvet, aged wood smoke, and nobility trying too hard. A servant offered to take my cloak. His hands were perfumed. His hands. I couldn't tell if I was being greeted or baptized in lavender. Lady Isolde swept in, swathed in brocade and trailing a scent cloud that nearly knocked me backward ambergris. I later learned whale vomit turned status symbol. She kissed the air beside my cheek and waved me toward a drawing room, where cushions oozed with potpourri, and 3 spaniels snored like they hadn't bathed since the last coronation. "Deuce it," she cooed, her powdered face glowing faintly in the candlelight. I had the hearth scented with pine and orange peel for your arrival. And she had, but it couldn't hide the undercurrent of chamber pot wafting through the floorboards. See, this was the cruel truth of noble homes. They were gorgeous, opulent, and gross. No one bathed regularly. They just perfumed the aftermath. Lace handkerchiefs dipped in rose water, gloves rubbed with musk, sachets sewn into gowns, even pomanders strung from belts and fans. It wasn't hygiene, it was olfactory war. The worst offender, the guest room. My chamber was richly furnished. Canopied bed, tapestries of saints and unicorns, a writing desk carved with griffins. A maid brought in a bowl of warm wine and cinnamon for my feet. I was touched. Then she left the nightjar, a chamber pot hidden under the bed. Still steaming from its last visitor, I stared at it for a long time, wondering if ghosts could fart. Later, dinner was served. The feast was splendid roasted pheasant, sugared plums, honey-glazed carrots. Everything smelled amazing until someone opened a window and the scent of the stables joined the party like a drunk uncle. No one flinched. Everyone just raised their pomanders to their noses like scented shields and kept chewing. I followed suit, pressing my clove and rose lifesaver to my face, while the Baroness across from me loudly explained how she hadn't washed her hair since Michaelmas, but refreshed it daily with violet dust. The Duke at the end of the table had a scent sponge tucked in his sleeve, a tiny cloth soaked in vinegar and mint. He dabbed it under his nose every time someone mentioned fish or taxes. One lord even bragged that his boots were lined with dried thyme to ward off the rot. I wasn't sure if he meant literal decay or moral decline, but I didn't ask, and yet, for all the excess and odor, there was something admirable in how these nobles weaponized scent. They refused to surrender to the stink. Instead, they curated it, choreographed it, made it part of their power play. Smell well, rule well. After dinner, I was invited to a game of cards. Perfumed gloves hit the table with every hand. I caught a whiff of bergamot every time Lady Isolde bluffed. I swear, you could cheat by sniffing. Later, as I prepared for bed, I found strewing herbs under the mattress, dried lavender and marjoram. Meant to keep fleas away and provide a faint aroma of not pain. It mostly worked. If you didn't inhale too deeply. That night, I lay in a featherbed that reeked of history and lilacs. Somewhere in the dark, a rat skidded past the wardrobe. My pomander was clutched to my chest like a holy relic. And you know what? I still slept better than I had in the monastery. Smoke and sanctity scented salvation in the monastery. I returned to the monastery with my clothes saturated in ambergris, pine resin, and the faint shame of noble luxury. I thought maybe the monks would notice. They didn't. Or if they did, They judged me silently through a fog of pickled onion breath and sanctified restraint. This time, I wasn't just a visitor. I was invited to participate in something they called a ritual cleansing. Don't get excited. There was no water involved, or soap, or even scrubbing, just incense, holy oil, and a lot of smoke. It felt more like a fumigation than a purification. It began in the chapel. The air was thick with frankincense and myrrh. Not the pleasant kind you find in holiday candles, no. This was the real deal. Raw resins burned in iron censers that hissed and sputtered like angry dragons. The scent clung to your throat, made your eyes water, and somehow still didn't cover the underlying smell of damp wool and sweat-stiffened robes. We lined up in silence. The monk in charge, Brother Severin, was a rail-thin man with a nose like a hawk's beak and a frown that seemed permanently etched into his face. He moved slowly, swinging the censer back and forth, muttering Latin under his breath, enveloping each of us in what I could only describe as holy fog. When he got to me, he paused. "You reek of wealth," he said. Without humor, "We'll burn that out." Acolytes came by with sprigs of rosemary and hyssop, brushing them over our shoulders like feather dusters blessed by the Pope himself. I suppressed a cough. My lungs were staging a protest. The oil came next. Blessed olive oil mixed with crushed herb sage, lavender, sometimes even mint. Brother Severin anointed our foreheads, our hands, and our feet, not rubbed. Mind you, just dabbed, as if touching too much flesh might invite temptation or worse. "Cleanliness, let the soul be fragrant," he said, "for the body is but dust." Poetic, slightly terrifying. We chanted, we knelt. We stood in a circle holding candles so thick with beeswax they smelled like a summer meadow dipped in wax and regret. It wasn't hygiene, it was theatrical sanctity, and I have to admit, it worked. Sort of, I felt cleaner, not in the way a bath cleans you, but like something unseen had been scoured off. The smoke, the oil, the repetitive chants, they reached some part of my brain that believed, or at least wanted to. After the ceremony, I was shown to the guest dormitory again. Same straw mattress, same lumpy board, same chorus of wheezing monks adjusting their habits in the dark. But something had changed. There was a sachet of herbs tucked into my bedding-dried chamomile, rose petals, and bay leaves. A small mercy, probably from Brother Ambrose, who had a soft spot for ritual, and a stash of semi-sweet dried fruit he wasn't supposed to have. I crushed the sachet in my hands and rubbed it on my temples like I'd seen him do. For a moment, everything smelled of earth and gardens and something almost clean. And then Brother Osric let out a snore that sounded like a goat being strangled in a wine barrel. Back to reality. The infirmary smells like redemption and a bit of pus. I never intended to visit the monastery infirmary. But then again, I never intended to eat half a cabbage that had been blessed, buried, fermented, and apparently resurrected for dinner. My stomach revolted like a peasant in tax season. They carried me in at dusk. The infirmary was tucked behind the main cloister, separated by a narrow hallway that always smelled faintly of burned rosemary and wet linen. A curtain served as the door, and once I crossed it, I was greeted by a wall of smell that nearly knocked me back outside. Imagine a mix of spoiled meat, crushed mint, bald sweat, and boiled leeks all undercut by that unmistakable tang of infection. You don't need a degree in medicine to recognize the scent of festering wounds. Your body knows. The healer was Brother Marius, a stout man with fingers stained yellow from grinding herbs and a permanent layer of ash on his robes. He greeted me like he was welcoming an old friend back from the dead. "You look pale," he said, poking my side, but not pale enough to skip confession. He chuckled. I did not. They laid me on a pallet straw again, but softer this time. Maybe because someone had died on it recently and it had been blessed. My head rested on a pillow that smelled strongly of camphor and old apples. Brother Marius handed me a clay cup of infusion. It was dark green and thick, smelling of basil, fennel, and possibly regret. I drank. I had no choice. That night, I didn't sleep, I floated. Fever dreams danced behind my eyes. In them, monks glided through corridors trailing ribbons of smoke. Choirs of herbs sang to me. At one point, I swear I saw St. Benedict offering me a steaming bowl of chicken stew, only to slap it away and mutter, "Gluttony." By dawn, I'd sweat through my clothes. The smell was spiritual. Somewhere between burned sage and boiled man, Brother Marius reappeared, this time armed with a mortar and pestle, a leech jar, and a cloth soaked in wine and vinegar. Medieval medicine wasn't subtle. You bled, you purged, or you prayed. If none of that worked, they assumed your soul needed healing more than your bowels. "Let's draw out the heat," he said cheerfully. I won't go into detail, but suffice it to say that leeches were involved. So was a poultice made of onions, garlic, and goose fat. My skin absorbed it. My dignity did not. The infirmary was a strange blend of compassion and compost. Pilgrims with broken feet lay next to monks with gout and boils. There were whispered prayers, groans, the rustling of linen, and the constant clink of clay pots filled with oils and elixirs that smelled like medieval salad dressing. Despite the stench, it was oddly comforting. These men, for all their bodily neglect, cared not just about your soul, but about your suffering. They couldn't stop the pain, but they could sit with you in it, anoint your feet, whisper psalms in your ear, and bathe your forehead in water drawn at dawn. And that meant something. When I left the infirmary 2 days later, lighter by several pounds and half my will to live, I smelled like vinegar, goat milk, and a hint of rosemary. Honestly, it was an upgrade. Feast of the Saints, glory, guts, and goat fat. I had just escaped the infirmary with my intestines mostly intact, and my dignity only moderately damaged when Brother Ewan informed me, beaming that I was in time for the feast of St. Alaric. "Fortunate timing," he said, clapping me on the back. "You'll love it. There'll be bread, meat, even wine after days of broth. Herbs and leeches. The thought of actual food nearly made me weep, until I remembered where I was. Feast days in the monastery weren't just about honoring the saints. They were full-blown spiritual raves without the music, unless you count Gregorian chant remixes echoing off stone walls. The monks fasted for days before the celebration. So when the bell rang that morning, there was a hunger not just of the body, but of the soul that crackled in the air like dry parchment on fire. The refectory had been prepared, meaning they'd swept most of the straw into corners, hung tapestries to hide water stains, and placed a single wilting flower in a wooden vase near the altar. A feast table, if you could call it that, was set with thick pottery bowls, pewter cups, and knives duller than the sermon I'd heard last week. But oh, the smell. It started subtle. Roasted garlic, fresh-baked barley bread, a whiff of pepper someone must have splurged. And then it hit. Lamb, real lamb, dripping with herb oil and smoke, seasoned with rosemary, and cooked over a fire that had been stoked since sunrise. I swear I saw a few angels hovering near the kitchen doorway just to get a whiff. Then came the cheese, aged and waxy, with the texture of sandstone, but somehow satisfying, and a jug of wine that had been cut with just enough water to make it holy and just enough chalk to make it awful. We drank it anyway. The feast began with a prayer that lasted roughly the time it takes to bake a flatbread. As soon as the final amen was uttered, there was a quiet fury of movement. Bowls passed, hands grabbed, spoons clanked. The monks didn't talk during meals. They had a designated reader to recite scripture, but they ate with conviction. I sat between Brother Ewan and a novice who sneezed violently into his pottage and then kept eating. I decided to ignore it. My stomach, still recovering, growled once and then rolled the dice. As I tore into the lamb tender and soaked in spice, I felt like I was being reborn. This wasn't just food. It was divine mercy with a side of goat fat. But it couldn't last. Halfway through the meal, a jug tipped. Someone's bread caught fire, don't ask. And the candle smoke set off a chain reaction of monastic sneezing that nearly drowned out the liturgical reading. A monk named Brother Giles choked on a peppercorn and had to be whacked repeatedly with a hymnal. And then came dessert. It was fruit paste moulded into the shape of a saint's face. We were instructed to honour the memory of St. Alaric by partaking reverently. I really did. But biting into a sticky, oversweetened relic head was an experience that sits somewhere between culinary sacrilege and traumatic dental work. After the feast, We filed out into the cloister gardens to walk off our sins. I watched one elderly monk pass wind so forcefully he startled a pigeon from the hedgerow. No one even blinked. The breeze, mercifully, carried the evidence away. The air was thick with incense and overcooked vegetables. And yet, despite the chaos, the odd smells, and the very real possibility of a return visit to the infirmary, I felt alive. These people weren't trying to live forever or even live well. They were just trying to get through the day fed, forgiven, and slightly less filthy than before. By evening, I was back in my cell, burping quietly and reeking of lamb fat, smoke, and dried apples. I took it as a sign of progress. If that's what holiness smells like, I thought I could learn to live with it. After the feast, after the incense, after the mild lamb-induced hallucinations, I was ushered still reeking into the confessional. Time to cleanse the soul. Brother Ewan whispered, as if I were heading into an exorcism. The confessional at St. Ethelgar's was not the dark, Gothic booth you might imagine. No curtain, no mysterious silhouette. It was a plain oak bench in a side chapel that smelled like wax, mildew, and stale breath. The priest sat behind a tiny screen carved with such enthusiasm it barely concealed his balding head. I knelt awkwardly, because my knees still hadn't forgiven the stone floors, and tried to look appropriately remorseful. He didn't look up, just inhaled through his nose like a man preparing for battle. "State your sins," he muttered. That was a big ask. I had a decade's worth of irreverent sarcasm, blasphemous thoughts, at least one case of holy envy. Brother Aldrich's candleholder was obviously nicer, and the occasional fantasy involving a bathhouse and 2 gallons of rose oil. I started small. I skipped a prayer service once. I whispered. Silence. Then the faint sound of scribbling. And I may have borrowed a consecrated biscuit. For science. He finally looked up. "What sort of science?" I shrugged. "Flavor testing. It's surprisingly salty." More silence. Then a sigh so deep, it sounded like he was releasing his own sins into the stone. "I see," he said. "Anything else?" I glanced around. Does resenting the smell of other monks count? He didn't answer, just reached for his jar of holy oil, dabbed it on a cloth, and handed it through the grill. "Rub this on your forehead. Lavender and frankincense. Helps with impure thoughts. And the stench." I obeyed. It burned slightly. He murmured a Latin phrase that probably meant, "Try not to set the place on fire with your spiritual decay." Then tapped the edge of the bench. "Now say 3 paternosters, 1 Ave, and take a barefoot walk to the shrine in the lower crypt." The lower crypt, of course, because nothing says spiritual purification like descending into a dank hole full of mold and dead people. Still, I did as told. The stairs to the crypt were slippery and steep, as if God wanted to test both your balance and your belief in the afterlife. The air grew colder with each step, thick with stone dust and sanctity. I reached the bottom and lit a small candle. The shrine stood in the center of the chamber, an altar draped in velvet, surrounded by the bones of minor saints and a few less fortunate pilgrims. I knelt. Again, my knees were staging a protest. I whispered the prayers, fumbled over the Latin, tried not to think about the fact that something was definitely moving in the corner of the room. It was probably just a rat or a saint. You never knew down here. By the time I staggered back upstairs, I felt not cleaner, exactly, but lighter, like I'd been spiritually exfoliated, scrubbed down with divine steel wool. Brother Ewan met me at the door, holding a small satchel. "Here," he said, "herbs. For your cell, helps keep the demons out." I sniffed. "Mint and marjoram, better than feet and fungus." He winked. "And maybe next time. Don't mention the biscuit." I shuffled back to my cell, the scent of forgiveness clinging to my skin like incense in wool. I was tired, vaguely absolved and hungry again. Holiness, I decided, was exhausting. The final smell, death, oil, and the candle that wouldn't go out. It was just past midnight when the bell rang the deep, slow toll that only meant one thing. Someone was dying. I was half asleep, tangled in my straw bedding, still digesting the ghost of St. Alaric's feast. But when you live in a monastery, death is part of the schedule. Like matins or mildew, you don't ignore the bell. You get up, even if your joints scream, Even if your robe is damp from the cold and your soul feels like yesterday's cabbage stew, Brother Anselm was waiting by the infirmary door, already holding the oil of the sick, a small clay flask with a stopper that never quite fit. He saw me approach and gave a solemn nod. "It's Brother Thomas," he whispered. "The old one with the cough." Brother Thomas had been coughing since I got there. Honestly, I wasn't sure he hadn't always been coughing, like it was part of his personality. I'd grown used to it, the raspy bark that echoed down stone corridors like an old dog stuck in the ventilation system. The infirmary smelled worse than usual damp wool, open wounds, and boiled leaks. But under all that was something else, something sweeter, but off, like wax that had burned too long, or flowers left too close to a heat source. It was death, and it hung in the air like a secret no one wanted to say out loud. Brother Thomas was barely conscious, skin pale, lips dry. He looked like parchment that had been through the wash. We gathered around his cot. One monk lit candles, another held open the psalter. I held the oil. Anselm dipped his fingers into the flask and began the rite. The smell of olive oil and frankincense filled the room. Heavy and familiar. It was meant to purify, to prepare the soul for departure, but it also clung to your nose, your clothes, your memory. He touched the old man's forehead, then his chest, murmuring the Latin phrases that I barely remembered from study. I watched the wax from the nearest candle drip slowly onto the stone floor. Every drop landed like a second ticking away. The thing about anointing the dying is that it's strangely intimate. You see a man at the edge of everything he's ever known, his body trying to hold on, his breath coming in little shreds, and you're standing there, oil on your hands, pretending you understand the moment. But you don't, not really. You just feel very small and very alive. Brother Thomas stirred, his eyes opened briefly cloudy, pale, but still searching. He looked at me and smiled. It was small, crooked, barely a twitch of the lips, but it stopped my heart. Then he exhaled once, deep, long, final. The candle flickered and he was gone. We stayed there in silence, letting the moment settle. No one cried, no one spoke, but there was this odd pressure in the room, like the stone itself was holding its breath. Anselm reached over and closed Thomas's eyes, then covered him with a thin linen sheet. Someone blew out the candle, except one wouldn't go out. It danced stubbornly, even as 3 monks huffed at it like overworked bellows. "It's a sign," Brother Ewan whispered behind me. "Maybe he's been accepted, or maybe the candle was just bad wax." But I didn't say that. They say that when a truly holy person dies, the room fills with the odor of sanctity, a fragrance of roses, myrrh, or something too beautiful to describe. I didn't smell that. I smelled oil, smoke, and old man feet. But I'd like to think that somewhere, in some higher place, Brother Thomas was laughing. Not because he'd been accepted, but because he'd finally gotten some peace and didn't have to hear us sing the morning hymns off key anymore. We wrapped his body in clean linen rare, carefully kept for just this purpose. Then we carried him in silence down the hall toward the crypt. The oil stayed on my fingers, sticky and fragrant. I rubbed it into my palms without thinking. Later that night, alone in my cell, I couldn't sleep. My robe still smelled like death oil and candle soot. I lay on the straw, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind creep through the cracks in the stone. It didn't feel sad. It felt quiet, clean, in a strange way, like something had passed through me, or maybe left behind something I couldn't see. I lit a tiny candle by my bedside. The flame danced, steady, gentle, and for once, the air didn't stink of rot or rain or regret. It smelled like nothing at all, which, in that monastery, was the closest thing to a miracle. The privy problem, medieval toilets, chamber pots, and unexpected splashes. Let me tell you something. They don't put in the illuminated manuscripts. Medieval toilets were an adventure. Not the good kind, like riding a warhorse into battle or stumbling across a secret wine cellar. No, this was the kind of adventure that ended with wet shoes, damaged dignity, and a prayer that whatever splashed on your foot wasn't what you thought it was. See, when I first arrived at the monastery, I thought there'd be some kind of system, maybe not modern plumbing, sure, but something. We had libraries, we had wine, we had scrolls written in 6 languages. But when it came to relieving yourself, you got a bucket, or, if you were lucky, a chamber pot with a crack in it and a handle that burned your hand in the summer sun. My first night, I asked where the facilities were. Brother Jerome, who'd clearly been waiting for this exact moment, smiled and said, "Out past the herb garden. Turn left at the goose pen. Follow your nose." That should have been the warning. The latrine, as it was called, was a narrow stone building, squatting pun fully intended, behind the monastery walls, like it knew it had been banished. Inside were a few wooden seats set over a deep trench. And let me tell you, no candle, no incense, no saint's relic could mask what waited below. The smell hit you like a theological rebuke. And the sound, splash, gurgle, drip, fart, moan. I swear one time I heard something bubbling, probably not demonic, but you could never be sure. Now, in some noble castles, they had something called a garderobe, a sort of toilet chute that emptied into the moat or a cesspit. Sounds fancy, right? Until you realize the moat was basically a toxic soup of excrement and fish, too dumb to swim away. Some poor servant had to clean the chutes. I met one once. He had the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd seen things, smelled things no one should have to relive. But back to my humble latrine. In winter, the stone seat froze, literally froze. If you weren't careful, your skin would stick. A monk once had to be peeled off with warm water and prayer. I wish I were joking. In summer, flies. So many flies it felt like the Lord had unleashed a plague just for our sins. And then there were the surprises. One night, I was hurrying back from evening prayers, desperately needing to go. It was dark. I forgot my candle. I found the latrine by smell, not hard. Dropped my robe, sat down, and immediately splashed. Right back up. I jumped so high I nearly levitated. Something wet had touched me, something alive. I bolted out of there like the devil himself had flicked me with a wet tail. Later, I learned a rat had fallen into the trench. They can't climb out, you see. They just swim, in circles, waiting. I didn't use that stall again, ever. Sometimes, when it rained too hard, the trench filled up, overfilled, and then everything backed up. The worst job in the monastery. Not copying manuscripts, not tending the vineyards. It was the night soil man, the poor soul assigned to shovel out the latrines with nothing but a wooden scoop, a strong stomach, and a chant on his lips. He usually did it barefoot. I still don't understand why. Occasionally, nobles would install perfumed cloths near their garderobes, herbs stuffed into the cracks, scented rose petals scattered on the floor. It helped a little. But trust me, once you've knelt down in an outhouse and seen a spider the size of a walnut staring back at you from the underside of the seat, all the lavender in the world won't make that memory go away. One visiting friar once bragged that his monastery had running water, actual channels carved into the stone that carried waste away using gravity. We were impressed until he told us they flushed once a week, with one bucket that they passed around. Let that image sit with you a moment. And yet, despite it all, there were rules about toilet use. You had to bless yourself before entering. You weren't allowed to talk once inside considered disrespectful, and you definitely, under no circumstances, looked anyone else in the eye if there were shared stalls. Some monks tried to time their visits during prayers just to avoid the crowd. Others used communal silence as a cover for, well, noisy activities. The result was a strange symphony of flatulence and forced dignity, all under a thick haze of ammonia. I remember one novice fresh-faced, eager, who brought his own pouch of mint leaves to sniff while using the latrine. Smart. I thought, until the pouch fell into the trench, he reached for it. We never saw him the same way again. But here's the kicker. It was normal. You got used to it. The smells, the splashes, the casual horror of dropping your rosary mid-squat and having to choose between faith and hygiene. It bonded us. In a weird way, to this day, when I smell rosemary and damp wood, part of me braces for a sudden splash and a panicked scream from the stall next door. So yes, medieval life had its grand cathedrals, its shining armor, its majestic Gregorian chants. But in between all of that, we squatted, we suffered, we survived. And we always brought an extra candle just in case the rat was still swimming. The smile that time forgot medieval teeth, breath, and dental despair. You don't realize how important teeth are until you lose one in a hunk of bread that's only slightly softer than stone. And in medieval times, that was practically a rite of passage. The first time it happened to me, I was biting into a barley loaf, crust baked hard from an open hearth fire. There was a crack not from the bread and then silence. My molar was gone. I swallowed it before I even realized what happened. Just sat there, blinking, wondering if I needed to confess to the local priest or a dentist, except neither could help me now. Here's the truth. Medieval dental care was basically medieval torture, dressed up with herbs and prayer. We didn't have dentists in the modern sense. What we had were travelling tooth pullers. And if that phrase sounds ominous, congratulations, you've got instincts. They often doubled as barbers or blacksmiths, which tells you everything you need to know about their surgical training. You'd find them in markets, usually under a canopy made of goat hide, surrounded by blood-streaked tools and a crowd eager for distraction. A man in pain would sit down, clutching his jaw, and the tooth puller would smile, offer a slug of ale or nothing at all, and then proceed to yank the offending molar out with a pair of iron tongs the size of a turkey leg. Sometimes they got the right tooth, sometimes they got two for the price of one. I remember once watching a man faint before the pliers even touched his lip. When he woke up, the wrong tooth was gone, and the tooth puller simply shrugged and said, "Come back next week. We'll try again." Toothpaste. Ha! We had powders, crushed bones, salt, vinegar, even chalk. I once tried a mint leaf and ash mixture. My breath smelled like someone set fire to a spice rack. The idea was to scrub with a linen cloth wrapped around your finger. No bristles, no handle, just grit and hope. Some of the nobility used powdered coral or burned eggshells, scented with cinnamon or rose petals. But for most of us, it was rinse with wine and spit, or just live with the funk. The monks were better off they had herbal remedies. Sage was a favourite, chewed to freshen the breath. Cloves helped to numb toothaches. Sometimes they'd mash up fennel seeds with vinegar and swish it around. It burned going in and didn't seem to help much, but it felt holy. Still, there were limits. One brother I knew had a rotting canine so bad it turned black. He just stopped opening his mouth when he spoke, mumbled his Latin through clenched teeth like a sinner chewing charcoal. We nicknamed him Brother Bitey, never to his face, of course. Breath. Let's just say halitosis wasn't a deal-breaker in medieval society. Everyone had it, between the meatless lentils fermenting in your gut and the half-rotted onions eaten raw. You were lucky if your breath didn't clear a room. Kissing must have been an act of war. And floss, don't be silly. The closest thing we had was a splinter from a broomstick or a frayed bit of twine. I tried it once, gave myself a mouthful of splinters and a firm respect for bleeding gums. Now, here's where things get real nasty. Sometimes people didn't pull the tooth. They drilled it. Yep. There were these ancient hand drills, slow, squeaky, nightmarish things. They'd drill out the center of the tooth and pour in a mixture of herbs and oils. Clove oil, beeswax, even honey. You can guess how well that went. Infection was common. Some folks died of dental abscesses. Others just walked around swollen, feverish, muttering prayers between sobs. I once helped carry a young novice back from one such treatment. His cheek was the size of an apple. The next morning, he'd bitten through his own tongue in his sleep. But even with all this, the weirdest part, some people had surprisingly good teeth. Why? Their diet. Medieval peasants didn't have sugar, not in the way we do now. No soda, no candy, no syrup-drenched pancakes. Their bread may have been brutal, but it wasn't cavity-causing. So while they were dropping teeth to infection or bad luck, they weren't rotting from candy. The real dental disasters, the nobles. They had access to sweet things, imported sugar, candied fruits, sweet wines, and they ate them constantly. Their teeth turned brown, cracked, and fell out in their 20s. There's a reason so many royal portraits from the 1400s have closed-mouth smiles. One noble woman I met had black teeth from years of honey wine and dried figs. She covered her mouth with a lace fan whenever she laughed. I thought it was modesty. Nope, just self-preservation. To this day, I still have dreams about the tooth puller's tongs. Waking up in a cold sweat, clutching my jaw, whispering not the molars, "Lord, Please, we joke about it now, those of us who survived with a few teeth intact. The blessed remain, we say, patting our gums like war veterans counting limbs. So if you're ever time traveling and find yourself in the 1300s, take this advice: chew slow, pray often, and whatever you do, don't sit in the market square under the goat hide canopy. Laundry day in hell, clothes, cleanliness, and medieval fabric woes. Let me tell you something that might surprise you. In the Middle Ages, doing laundry could be a sin, or at least a scandal. I learned that the hard way. It was a damp spring morning when I decided to wash my tunic. I'd been wearing it for 3 weeks straight, yes, 3. Between the wood smoke from the hearth, the goat stench from the barn, and my own personal funk, the poor thing smelled like it had been baptized in suffering. So I slipped out to the stream behind the monastery, laid out my shirt on a rock, and started scrubbing with a piece of soap I'd bartered off a traveling merchant. It was made from pig fat and ashes and smelled like regret, but it bubbled. That was enough. I thought I was doing something good. I was wrong. Brother Matthias spotted me and gasped like I'd committed murder. "That's your habit," he cried. "You're not supposed to wash your humility away." He marched me to the abbot, and I got a lecture that lasted longer than Lent. Apparently, washing your robes too often was considered prideful, a sign that you cared more about appearances than piety. Dirt was spiritual. A crusty collar meant discipline. Cleanliness, that was for the weak of soul. Let me paint you a picture of a typical monk's dormitory. Long, narrow rooms lined with simple wooden planks, each with a straw mattress and a wool blanket. No pillows, no privacy, no personal space, and, perhaps most importantly, no laundry schedule. We all wore the same thing every day. Woolen habits, brown or grey depending on the order. In summer, they were hot. In winter, they were still hot until they got wet. Then they were icy sacks of mildew. But we didn't complain. Much. Okay, I complained constantly, but quietly. Most monks wore their habit until it basically disintegrated. One story passed around the refectory claimed that a hermit wore the same robe for 25 years. Never washed it, never changed it. Died in it. They say it walked to the grave by itself. Lice were just part of the deal. You got them. You scratched. That was life. Now, if you were noble, things were different. Kind of, you had linen shirts and underthings fancy, soft, and easily washed. But did they wash them? Not as often as you'd hope. Rich folks would air out their clothes instead of cleaning them. Just hang them by the fire or wave them out a window. If they were really feeling fancy, they'd sprinkle them with rose water or rub them down with scented cloths. But actual washing risked ruining the fabric, especially silks and velvets. Oh, don't even get me started on velvets. Those things were allergic to water. Wash one wrong and it'd shrivel like an autumn leaf. So instead, they wore layers of fabric soaked in perfume and sweat, tied up with embroidery and good intentions. Ever hugged a noble in July? Smells like onions wrapped in lilac and lies. Back in the village, we had wash days, usually once a month, sometimes more if we weren't in drought or famine or war. We'd head down to the river with bundles of clothing, barrels of grey soap, and gossip hotter than the sun. The women would beat the garments against rocks while catching up on who stole whose chicken, or which child might be the blacksmith's instead of the miller's. Kids ran wild. Someone always ended up wet and angry. The clothes, they got sort of clean. The river did most of the work, along with brute force and prayers. No bleach, no detergent, just determination and elbow grease. We hung everything on bushes or branches. And if it rained, well, you tried again next month. My mother used to say, a clean tunic won't save your soul, but it'll keep the rats guessing. She wasn't wrong. We made do with what we had. Our socks had more holes than fabric. Our shirts stiffened with wear. Underthings were passed down like heirlooms patched, restitched, worn thin until they resembled spider webs. And heaven forbid you ripped something, you'd have to sew it, which meant threading a needle by candlelight with fingers numb from fieldwork. Laundry wasn't just a chore, it was an ordeal. And God help you if someone spotted a woman hanging undergarments on the church fence to dry. Scandal. Pure scandal. One time, old widow Agnes dried her bloomers on the chapel gate. Next Sunday, half the town refused communion. The other half took notes. Even worse were the diseases. Clothes weren't just dirty, they were dangerous. Fleas, lice, scabies. Even the plague your tunic could kill you. Doctors, when they existed, advised burning garments worn by the sick. Not washing, burning. That should tell you something. The idea of laundry as cleansing physically or spiritually was complicated. Some religious orders scrubbed their altar linens obsessively with scented oils, but refused to wash their bed sheets. You tell me how that adds up. I remember once asking a friar why we couldn't just clean our robes once a week. He looked at me, dead serious, and said, "The dirt reminds us we are not yet in heaven." Fair enough. Still, on warm days when the sun hit just right and the stream ran fast, I sometimes snuck away, washed my socks, hung them under a tree where the breeze could carry away the stink, and for one blissful hour, I felt almost human. Of course, then a goat would eat one, and I'd be back in church barefoot, muttering apologies to Saint Anthony. But hey, at least I smelled like soap. The end of my nose. Final thoughts on smell, survival, and sanity. By now, dear reader, you've probably figured out something crucial. In the Middle Ages, it wasn't just your soul that had to be strong, it was your nose. I survived plagues, prayers, pickled onions, and a bunkmate who snored like a drowning ox. But the thing that nearly broke me, the stench. See, your sense of smell wasn't just a passive observer, it was your constant companion judging, warning, occasionally passing out. You woke up to it, lived in it, and sometimes, if you were lucky, escaped it for an afternoon if the wind was right, and you stood downwind from a rosemary bush. Even now, years later, I swear the scent of damp wool makes my spine straighten like I'm about to be called to vespers. But it wasn't all bad. Smell was how we navigated the world. In a time before soap dispensers and toothpaste commercials, you learned quickly if the cheese had gone sharp enough to bite you, you probably shouldn't eat it. If a noble's perfume made your eyes water, steer clear, he's either hiding gout or sin. And if someone passed you on the road smelling like frankincense, wood smoke, and dried fish, you didn't recoil, you respected them, because that meant they'd made a pilgrimage, that they'd walked, sweated, suffered, that their stink was sacred. We wore our smells like badges. A blacksmith had fire in his beard. A shepherd carried the breath of sheep. A monk like me, I smelled like silence, smoke, and too many unanswered questions. Still, it wore on you. Some nights, lying on my straw mattress, I'd fantasize about a future where people had hot water on demand, scented shampoos, toothbrushes that didn't taste like pine sap and iron filings. A world where people didn't have to carry pomanders or mash lavender into their armpits like desperate witches. And then I'd laugh quietly, of course. Or Brother Petrus would wake up and hit me with his sandals. But secretly, I believed in that world. I believed that someday, someone would find a better way. Maybe that's why I paid attention, why I made notes, mental ones. Mostly of smells, of routines, of what worked, what didn't. The old world wasn't clean, but it wasn't stupid either. We understood that scent mattered, even if we didn't understand bacteria or germs. We knew that rot meant danger, that incense could calm a crowd, that sweet smells, rare as they were, brought comfort, especially in the face of death. I remember a funeral once, young girl, just 13. The plague had taken her. The family burned rosemary and thyme around her body, placed rose petals beneath her arms. It didn't stop the rot, but it helped the grief. It gave her passing a kind of softness, a kind of grace. Sometimes, scent was all you had. So where does that leave me now? Older? Definitely. Wiser? I'd like to think so. I've traded my habit for something softer, my straw bed for something less pokey, but I still keep a bundle of herbs by the window, still light a bit of dried sage on cold evenings, still sniff the air when I pass through old stone buildings, and when I catch the faintest whiff of beeswax, sweat, and ancient linen, I don't flinch. I remember the quiet of the cloister at dawn, the way wax melted over your fingers during prayer, the stink of unwashed feet during procession, the raw smell of rain on church stone, the sweet, improbable scent of a clean shirt after a month of mud. And most of all, I remember what it meant to survive it, to walk through the world with your nose assaulted at every turn and still say, Yes, this is life, and it's mine. So, to you, my modern friend, next time you step into a hot shower, light a candle, or throw your shirt in the wash for the second time that week, say a little thank you, not to me, to your ancestors, to the ones who scrubbed linen with rocks, who survived on garlic and barley, who fought disease with cloves and sheer stubbornness, to the ones who walked so you could Febreze, and maybe sniff the air and be grateful you live in a time when the smell of sanctity doesn't come with lice. As for me, I'll keep my soap, my silence, and a little sachet of rosemary, just in case. And so, here we are, after 20 pages of steam, sweat, stews, and a surprisingly heroic nose. We've made it out the other side. You, brave listener, have time-traveled with me through the ranks of monks who wore humility like a second skin, literally, through bathhouses that doubled as both cleansing stations and sin dens, through castles where perfume was sprayed not to attract, but to survive. If you're anything like me, you'll never walk past a rosemary bush or light a scented candle again without whispering a little medieval prayer of gratitude. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone complains about a gym locker room smell, you'll smile and think, buddy, you don't know stench, but more than just laughs and wrinkles of the nose. I hope you take away this: history isn't dead. It lingers in our rituals, in our habits, even in our scents. Every era leaves its trace, not just in books, but in breath. Thank you for walking and sniffing through this journey with me. Thank you for lending me your ears and trusting me with your imagination. If you enjoyed this strange, stinky little ride through the past, I'd love for you to follow and rate the podcast. Maybe even share it with a friend who has a strong stomach and a curious mind. Your support keeps this candle lit and the stories flowing. Got thoughts, questions, favorite stinky historical moments of your own? I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment, send a message, or shout it from the village square. But honestly, DM is faster. This has been your host at History Podcast, signing off with the wisdom of centuries and the scent of aged goat cheese. Till next time, stay curious and stay pleasantly fragrant.